Today we bring you a very different era of Toyota. When you think of 90s, 80s Toyota sports cars, the first car that pops to mind is the Mark IV Supra. But today I want to share with you two cars that are a lot nicer and they are super hidden gems. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Toyota 90s sport cars. This is an MR2, or Mr. 2 as I like to call it. It is simply a hidden gem. It is such a beautiful car, simple, reliable, and super fun. And then right next to it is the Celica All Trac Turbo. This is not your Corolla with two doors. This is the one to get. This is the proper one. The rally heritage and everything about it. In today's video, we're gonna check these cars out because they're true icons and in my opinion, total hidden gems from this era of Toyota sports cars right after this. I still can't believe we have these two cars in the shop. I love them so much. Folks, this is a 1991 Toyota MR2 Turbo. And at the same time in the shop, we have this 1990 Celica All Trac Turbo. See, these cars were from the same era. They're exactly the same era. They have the same engine, almost the same transmission, but yet they are so different, vastly different. This was meant to be a fun track car, while this was not meant to be a track car. This was a rally car. And they have the same engine, but they're so different in the way they were implemented. And this was the time where Toyota took things to the next level. Now, in today's world, they take things to the next level with hybrid cars, with kind of family cars. They're still making cars well, but this was the era where they really went out of their way to make things different. Let us start with the Celica. Let's kind of take a tour around it. Of course, this has pop-up headlights and this very interesting look. You know, these two like black, if you really get close to them, they almost look like carbon fiber. They're not, but that was the beginnings of things. But then you look at this hood scoop. I mean, you look at newer cars from Toyota, they have fake hood scoops and fake this, fake that. This was actually not fake. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, and these little vents, they're not fake. They're very, very important and purposeful. But then we wrap around the car, very basic wheels, nothing really out of the world about them. And you notice the wheels are huge. This was the thing of the 90s. They didn't really put skinny tires and the very small wheels. And look at this very over-elaborate mirror. They really spend the time. This mirror doesn't even fold. And just, that was a different time. Then the sunroof, an actual sunroof. See, folks, you hear the word sunroof and you hear the word moonroof. This is a sunroof. It's a metal piece. A moonroof technically is supposed to be glass so you can see through it even when it's closed. And this is a sunroof where it's just for the sun. You open it, sun comes in, close it, no sun. That's the difference between the two in case you haven't heard about that before. Then we wrap around the back, very basic, wiper in the back, of course. And we have the wing, and basically this looks like any other Celica except Turbo. All Trac makes all the difference. This turns this Celica from basically a two-door Corolla to a special car. This is truly a special car. And even though this car has this like rallying heritage and all that, the interior, there are some pretty interesting things. Let's check out the interior, which has a few interesting things about it. The first thing is, this has leather seats, very nice leather seats. Folks, this car is very old. Of course, the leather have seen better days, but it's holding up pretty well. But then there are the little features. See, I sit in this car, you notice the steering wheel is moving, because when I put my key in, actually I can bring it down. But watch what happens when I remove the key. It has a little solenoid that brings the steering wheel up so you can come out, and it locks it. You only need the key. As soon as you put your hand on the wheel, it comes in. This is just little stuff. This is how they did kind of cool features. And of course, this is a Celica All Trac. And in case you forget, it says it right there. Manual transmission, and the interior design of this is kind of like a mini cockpit. It's not a super cockpit, kind of like the Supra, but it's like a mini cockpit. You do have the turbo gauge, which is beautiful. This beautiful car has 31,000 miles. It came in for two concerns, which I will show you when we pop the hood. We'll talk about it. But what a simple, basic interior for a car that is actually, this is a serious car for its time. It has a proper all-wheel drive. We'll take a look underneath it and when we talk about under the engine. But this is a true pleasure. Of course, it's manual transmission, 5-speed. And the coolest thing about this is, if you look right here in the middle, we have kind of like the Mark III Supra. This little adjustment right here, this actually adjusts the bolsters on the driver's seat, which is something not even new cars have today. And this thing and the Mark III Supra in this generation had that, and it's actually the exact same location and the exact same button. Now let's check out the MR2. These two cars, very similar, but the MR2 has a very different personality. Again, this is the 90s, pop-up headlights, this was a thing. But you notice this car has a very, serious look. And this, to me, it's one of the most beautiful cars out of this area. I really love this car. You notice the big fog lights. They're actually the same size as the Celica, but the Celica is covered up because it's meant for a different purpose. This is a little bit different. Then you wrap around the side, and you have, instead of the front, kind of the black of the Celica, you have this line that runs across it. It just gives it a very special look. The most important thing about this car is the MR part. This car is mid-engined, rear-wheel drive. So the engine is actually in the back, which we're going to take a tour of in a second, but it just gives it a very interesting look. Look at the side profile. Almost feels like you sit way more to the front than any other car you see, and that's because the engine sits right behind you. There are some cool, interesting things because of that. You have vents here, vents on the other side. When we look under the hood, we're going to talk about what these vents are, what they do. This particular one doesn't have a sunroof. It has targa tops. Very cool, see-through targa tops. They're all glass. And this is not some plastic. This is actual glass, which is very cool. You look at the back. Before we get to the back, look at this curve of this glass. This is a very elaborate glass. I mean, they could have made this glass just flat and ends right here. Would have been fine, but no, they had to do this very interesting glass, which is, I can imagine how difficult this glass was to make, because this is difficult. Now, these vents, this is where the engine is, but wait, they didn't stop there. This car actually has a trunk. Let's open it. This actually has a trunk full of parts, because we'll talk about the owners in a bit. It's actually a pretty large trunk for what this car size is. And again, the most important part about this MR2 is this little turbo badge. That makes it the extremely cool part, or the not cool part. Now, this particular MR2 does have slight modifications. One of them is this taillight. I usually like these stock, but this actually looks pretty cool. I like it. I like it a lot. But they could not leave the MR2 without giving it something special. See, the Celica has that steering column that comes up when you pull the key and comes down when you put the key. This one doesn't have that. So how do we get our special 90s cool feature? This car, I'm going to show you a little clip here. When it's locked and you can't see where the key is, of course this doesn't have remote. You can't see where to put the key, and we don't want to scratch our beautiful MR2. If you pop the handle, it actually lit the keyhole, and you can put the key and not have to scratch the car to put the key and unlock it. Such a little detail. Then we look at the inside of it. It's a very different feel than the Celica. This one is a lot smaller, doesn't have back seats, although the Celica has samples for seats. It says MR2 on the steering wheel. It's very, very basic interior. There's not that cockpit feel. It's just focused. There is no fuss or unwanted drama. It is a focused driver's car. And the coolest thing about this is it has a very interesting turbo gauge right in the middle of the instrument cluster there. Very basic gauges. This one does have 50,000 miles, original owner. They both are. Very basic HVAC controls. I mean, there's not much going on here. That's the beauty of these cars. They don't distract you. You're just focused on driving and enjoying these cars. Now, something about the MR2, because the engine is in the back, you wonder what's in the front. Well, let's find out. So there is a hood release. Let's go look. You open the hood. There is actually nothing. The radiator in this car is actually here. So when we look underneath it, we're going to talk about it. All the coolant stuff comes here and then goes back. And this is the only thing about these. Battery sits right here. I believe there's supposed to be a spare tire here. The newer ones will say midship runabout, which this one doesn't here at least. Perhaps it said it somewhere else. Do comment if you do know that it says it. But you have a lot of storage here, and you have an actual trunk. And that's the cool thing about these things. And of course, the brake master cylinder is here, and the booster. Wiper motor, again, we're talking 90s Toyotas. Wiper motor is here, which is one of the things that we are doing to this car. The wipers just stop in the middle whenever you stop them. Doesn't have their park feature working. We tried to get this motor. It's not available, so we're actually going to try to take this apart and see if we can fix it, maybe clean some of the contacts. I'm thinking the parking feature is not working, so we're going to look into that. But that is the front. Now let's go look at the back as we start talking about the technical stuff of these cars. Both of these cars have the same engine. In the Mr. 2, which is what I like to call this, if you open this handle, which normally you're used to in any Toyota, this opens the trunk. But if you want to get to the engine bay, you have to reach all the way here somewhere. There it is. Now you've opened the engine bay. And in the MR2 Spider, in case you're wondering, it is in the glove box. That's where it is. Now there's something to be said about the MR2 with the 3S GTE, which is the engine for this car. It's a beautiful engine. We're going to talk about it in details right now, but it is extremely difficult to work on. That is one of the downsides of it, because you literally have to work over the car, and you have this in the way, and everything is basically backwards. The intake is here, the exhaust is there, and you're used to approaching this engine from this way, which we're going to look at in the Celica, and everything here is backwards. Service is very interesting on this, and this car is actually in the shop for a timing belt and valve cover gasket. Valve cover gasket, not so bad. Timing belt, very bad. It's very tight, let's put it this way. This engine, let's go back to the technical stuff. This is a 3S GTE, and it is, for lack of a better word, a masterpiece, a total hidden gem, an engine that, to my eyes, as a mechanic, as a Toyota enthusiast as well, it is at the level of the 2JZ. There's no way other to say it. Perhaps the cars it was put in didn't get as much popularity to really have the support, but this is a really groundbreaking engine. This is co-developed with Toyota and Yamaha. And anytime you see the word Yamaha with Toyota, they really produce masterpieces. This engine is actually turbocharged. And we'll look at the turbocharger. It's right there in the Celica when we look at it. But it is turbocharged as CT26, which is the same thing as the Mark III Supra 7M turbo. It's exactly the same turbo. It is intercooler, air-to-air intercooler. This is, of course, vacuum operated. Everything is vacuum in this area. This engine has a distributor, which is possibly the only limiting factor of this engine. If you can upgrade it to something that is not distributor, you can open its potential a little bit. What a masterpiece of an engine, this one. I really like this engine. There's a lot of little quirks about it that are just interesting. For example, this is dual overhead cam. In this time period, that was still a cool thing. And some of the not so cool things about it. You look, if you turn around a little bit, Jose, and show them that. That is the worst idea in the planet. That is the old school mass airflow, which has a little door, flap door that opens and measures how much the door is opening against the spring, and that's how it knows how much air is coming in. Notorious for problems. BMW also had a similar design, which was not a good idea. This is, it's just, I can't stop saying this is a beautiful engine to look at, not to work on, right? Yeah. Something interesting, and as we transition to the Celica, so you can see it, I want you to see the differences between the two. This was meant to be kind of a, you could daily drive it, and it's a track car. So any car that has this engine in the back, things are very complicated with cooling, and that's the problem. You notice these vents, the actual vents that channel the air out and only here, so you can expel the heat out. So they're functional vents. But you notice the intercooler. So here's the turbo outlet. The intercooler goes here, and then the air comes back into the engine. So if we come around and we look where that intercooler is, it's actually right here. So this vent is a very functional vent. That's where the intercooler is. And you can kind of see it through it. We'll show you a little clip of it. But on the other side, the vent is actually just, you can see it through here, you can see daylight through it. This is just a vent so you can push air through here, take some of that hot air, channel it through here and out. See how this was? They really thought of the little stuff. And it's just a beautiful engine to look at, not to work on, because this is not fun. I haven't done this job. We haven't worked on this car yet. We're just kind of still talking to the customer, figuring out what they want to do and what they do not want to do. But the Celica is actually done. We did a timing belt, and I'll share with you another thing that we did. Speaking of the Celica, let's make our way there so you can see the differences between these two cars, which has basically the same engine. Now, you remember when we were looking at the outside of the Celica, I told you this was an actual hood scoop. And when we talked about them initially, this was a track car, this was a rally car. You can't put a giant intercooler in the front or the side of a rally car. It's just going to get full of dirt and mud, and that's about it. So they put the intercooler on top. And this is potentially the coolest thing about this car. The intercooler is right there. And this is an actual vent that feeds that intercooler air. And these little vents, they're also for heat. So heat would come out of here, and you can control your underhood temperatures. Folks, this engine is exactly the same as the one in that MR2, except the intercooler location. That's why they look so different. They're exactly the same. This is a 3S GTE. Let's dive into some of the technical little stuff that this engine has. So this engine only has, it has two belts, two drive belts, very basic. Well, not really basic to replace, but some interesting things about it. This shares a lot with the 5S, which is an engine that they used in Camrys, basic cars. This was kind of the hot version. They took that engine, they modified it with Yamaha, and they come out with this version. The main distinguishing feature of this is dual overhead cam and a proper dual overhead cam. 16 valve, this was pretty much the norm at the performance engines of this era. Turbocharge, here's that turbocharger that we couldn't see in the MR2 because it's in the back. You see how things are backwards here. This is a CT26, which is a pretty decent turbo, but again, it's 90s turbos. They love to leak oil and blow seals and whatnot. This one has a little bit of play, even at 31,000 miles. Interesting things about this engine from this era that was kind of the groundbreaking stuff. This is a timing belt engine. It doesn't have a manual tensioner. Oh, the 5S does. This has a hydraulic tensioner, which is actually something pretty groundbreaking at the time. The oil pump is located all the way at the bottom. It is driven by the timing belt, which was the next best thing after you look at the very modern cars where they started being driven by the nose of the crank. It's actually a very cool design. The only not cool thing about it is it loves to leak oil. There's 2 seals on this oil pump that love to leak oil on this and equally on the 5S. Now we look at some specific stuff to the Celica. Because this is a rally car and because there's a lot of heat here, the turbo is right here and the intercooler is right there, and this is a very busy engine bay. The alternator could overheat. So they put a very elaborate vent that we're going to look at when we look underneath these cars where this ends. Do you see this vent? It actually cools the alternator. Very cool to see that. I don't think there's any car out there that has this. The only issue with these 2 cars, which I have to be honest, and now we're going to talk about it, service. They're not fun cars to work on. That's the God honest truth. I've been doing this for a very long time as a technician, and I've worked with Toyota. I love these 2 cars. This was a nightmare. There's no other way to say it. This was very difficult to work on. I mean, just look here. I can't even reach the engine mount. Things are very, very tight in this engine bay. I mean, you look how busy it is. This has, of course, ABS. This is the ABS unit, and it's a very ancient ABS. You have this area where you're going to be servicing this car very often, changing the timing belt. Look how much busy it is. AC lines, power steering, all your brake lines are going through here. And it's just such a tight space that this was the only problem working on this car is space. It's worse on the MR2, in my opinion. In my opinion, these are probably not very DIY friendly in that regard. This has the same mass airflow, which loves to go. But the other thing that brought this particular Celica to the shop is the speedometer stopped working. And this is another common thing, which I'm going to show you exactly what we found, how we fixed it, and what is the common thing about them. Here's what we found with the Celica on the speedometer not working. This is a speedometer gear sleeve. Folks, this is extremely complicated because this was a transition between speedometer cables and electronic stuff. And this was kind of the cross. Do you see this little sleeve that has this little thing sticking out of it that turns? This is actually supposed to look like this with a gear on it. Well, the gear broke. That's pretty common on these. Now, here's the complication. Oh yeah, it's very simple. Let's just pull this out, replace the gear, and put it back in. Except in the Celica, this sits all the way in the back of the transmission. You have the transfer case there, so you can't really easily access it, and you have this much room. It's very difficult. We had to remove the distributor. We had to just dig all this side out just to reach this, which then it's very tight to get out because this doesn't just sit there and the cable attaches to it. Here's how this goes. This is a speedo gear. This has a little keyway that goes in it, and then this little keyway connects it to this 90-degree turn, which goes somewhat like this. Once I can connect it. And then when you turn, when the transmission turns the little gear, it actually turns the middle of this. Then there's another keyway that goes here, and that keyway has an electronic sensor connected to it. Then another keyway connects there. Then the speedometer cable that goes to the gauge. The problem is, when you finally get this bolt out, which this bolt is all the way in the back, and it's a very difficult spot, this is seized because the O-ring is old. Of course, now it comes right out, but in the car, you have to be very careful. You don't want to just pry things off. Once you finally manage to get this out, and of course, this will go flying out as usual, this is in the transmission, and you have this much room to pull it out very slowly and kind of walk it out. Folks have said that you have to remove the transmission, and that's what the book says. You can actually do this in the car, but it's extremely tight and extremely difficult to do, especially when this seizes. And that's why I replaced the sleeve. I had to lightly tap on this sleeve back, forth, load it up with PB Blaster, just rust penetrant, walk it slowly, because if you just go hammer hands on this, you could crack the transmission case, and that's not good. We're not going to damage the car to fix something. This took a very long time. And if you're worried about this little plastic gear falling inside the transmission, it usually comes apart in a million pieces, and the little tiny remnants, you replace the fluid, most of it comes out, and that's about it. But that was the job that brought us this car, and the customer actually had a gear, and I've ordered a gear for him, and the sleeve, it comes in a kit. And he actually had this sleeve as well. He wanted to replace some of these keyways. We have an additional keyway here, and this one, we're going to keep it with him because I ended up talking to him. He's going to save these parts. This is such a common problem on these cars that it eventually in the future will happen, and these are becoming very hard to find, so we're going to preserve that. But other than that, let me show you some of the parts of the 3 SGT. This is the timing belt we pulled out of this. It's not completely shredded or gone, but again, that's the whole point. You don't want to wait for it to do that, especially in a car like this, which apparently mechanics don't want to work on. I don't blame them. I understand it's very tight, but I mean, the job is a job. This is one of the drive belts. The other drive belts sitting somewhere there. We actually replaced them because they have to come out anyways. This is the tensioner idler. So this is where the tensioner pushes on. And of course, you go in the timing belt like this, replace everything in your way, especially on an older car. This is that hydraulic tensioner, which is a very odd looking tensioner. You notice it's all oily because the cam seals and the crank seals, and that's those 2 seals that I told you for the oil pump, were all leaking all over the place. I don't think this has ever been replaced. Timing belt was done once on this. Another idler for the timing belt. And then the water pump, which is, this is a whole housing water pump. This is an OEM one that I found. The only difference between this water pump and like the 5S regular water pump is this little outlet, which is actually for the oil cooler, because this engine does have an oil cooler, which is pretty cool. Folks, let us put each one of these cars up on the lift. Let us look underneath them, and we'll check them out from underneath. Let's take a quick tour underneath the Mr. 2. The first thing is, of course, there's no engine here. This is a Mr. 2 part. But we're going to roll around and look at this very interesting thing. This has a pretty large radiator, because it needs it, and we'll talk about that in a second. 2 electric fans, but if you look all the way up here, kind of from this angle, you notice that it's closed up over here. They don't want to push that heat into this area. They actually want, that's why this is wide open. They want to push the heat out and underneath and away. That is pretty interesting that they did that little thing. But let's look at the front suspension here, which is very, very basic. For a car that handles this good, this is very basic suspension. This style control arm is something we don't see anymore with Toyota. It's a 1-point control arm. So normally control arms will have 2 fixing points. This one has 1, but then you have this little bar that kind of supports it from moving front to back. This supports it from going out and in, and then a little tiny ball joint. Ball joint that is old design from Toyota, and it is still separate from the knuckle. Very, very cool design. Now, the strut is one of those deals where the strut kind of comes down and gets crimped here. You can, I suppose, call it a McPherson design, but it's not exactly McPherson, modern McPherson that you're used to. You have the tie rod right here, which connects to the rack, and then very cute looking 2-piston caliper. It's a very small 2-piston caliper, but hey, you can tell that they had performance in mind when they made this car. And then of course, the little brake duct. This actually lets air go through and out through the wheel. And this little stuff, everything is covered in the front, and you'll notice there's absolutely nothing on the sides. It's just all closed off and flat. And this whole underbelly is almost flat. You didn't see that much in those times. But you notice this plastic cover. And the reason for that plastic cover is you have a lot of things going on here. You have heater lines, you have AC lines, you have coolant pipes, and you have the brake lines going on here. A lot is going on here. This is a very busy area of the MR2, and leading up to the engine and the transmission. You notice they're orientated like a front-wheel drive car, but they are in the back. So everything, they literally took the engine and put it exactly the same orientation as it would go in the front, in the back. So everything, if you're used, like when we look at the Celica, everything is backwards here because it's facing the wrong way. You're looking at it from the wrong angle. Not really, it's facing the same way. This particular MR2 does have an aftermarket exhaust. It actually sounds pretty cool. But let's look at the rear suspension before we talk about a few things with the engine. This is, of course, rear-wheel drive. So that's the R in the MR. Pretty interesting axle because it's very, very short between the two boots. And then you have kind of a support bearing, and then it goes. Usually this style, this size cars, they don't have a support bearing for the axle. This one does, because it's a very short axle actually. So technically it doesn't need that, but they did that for stability. And then in the rear, you have a very similar suspension to the front, but with a little bit of add-ons. You have the same control arm here, single point, and then this little rod that supports it. But then we have the little toe adjustment. This is something that got carried to the future actually, into many newer cars. This little toe adjustment. Full-on McPherson strut in the back, just a regular, you'll see it in many, many Toyota models. And then the parking brake. This was kind of a groundbreaking thing. This parking brake's actually not in the rotor hat or anything. It has rear disc brakes. It was a spring loader, so this pushes the caliper on, and that's how it locks the parking brake. Very cool. But let's get back to the powertrain, because this, I believe, don't quote me on this, is an E153 transmission. Very good transmission. You notice this. This is like where they left room for improvement, but they never really caught on with it. This is a manual transmission. This is a cooler should connect here. And you can easily just buy a cooler and connect it right here, which is super cool. This is a really serious transmission, very rugged, very good transmission. And of course, we talked about the engine. This is the 3S GTE by Yamaha and Toyota. It's a beautiful engine, extremely difficult to work on. I mean, this thing, yeah, I haven't worked on this one yet. We haven't done the job on this. Celica we did. So yeah, there's a lot of happy moments coming up with this, but that's the owner trusted us with this car, and we gotta do them right and take our time. These things take long on these. Now this is the oil leak that this car kind of brought this car here. Valve cover is leaking all the way from the top to the bottom. It's very typical with these. But the MR2 originally has dual exhaust. This one has a single because it's an aftermarket one, but you notice the cutout and the hanger here. It originally does have dual exhaust, which is, this is just a beautiful car. To me, I am almost borderline between loving a Supra from this generation, loving this more than the Supra from this generation, because this is just a beautiful car. One difference between this and the Celica though, and it's kind of interesting to me, if you turn around, Jose, and we show them right here, you notice the alternator is right here, which is really not a good spot, makes it really difficult to change. And then the Celica is right at the top, as we looked at. This is the only difference that I see between the two, but otherwise they're very similar. Of course, this is rear-wheel drive only, Celica is all-wheel drive, hence the All Trac part. Let's take a look underneath the Celica All Trac, which is, even though these two cars are the same generation, I want you to see the difference in design. First thing is, of course, this is primarily was a front-wheel drive car, but this particular one is all-wheel drive. This car was meant for rallying, as we said. So there are specific touches that are important. First thing is, this also has an almost flat underneath. There's nothing really sticking out. But then we look at things like this. Remember that alternator vent that we talked about? It actually starts right here, which is very cool. And then there's this bump. And most people will look at this and wonder, what is this? Like, what exactly does this do? And that was my thought initially. There's not a lot of information on what this exactly does, except one thing. When you are rallying, instead of hitting the subframe, which will actually push up and hit the radiator, this is a pump stop. That's the purpose of that. Don't quote me on that because the source is a little bit unreliable on this, but it does make sense that that's what this is, because otherwise there's nothing here. Then we move on from that, 3S GT engine, which this one did have a valve cover leak. We took care of it. This is actually not a leak. This is coating for rust protection. This is a similar transmission to the one in the MR2 that we looked at, but if you notice, if you turn around, Jose, show them this. Remember when we showed you that little loop where you could connect a cooler? This one actually does have a cooler connected to it, which is super cool that this old school transmission has, it's a manual transmission that has oil cooler for the transmission. You don't really see that a lot, even in today's cars. Let's look at the front suspension. Big control arms. Because again, this is a rally car. This is meant to take a lot of beating. Not really delicacy of like an MR2 on a track. This is meant for like off-road. You're going to drive off the road. So you notice it's a 2-point connection control arm, much bigger and beefier control arm. Same deal with the axle. You do have a support bearing right here. Again, to give it a little bit more structural integrity. The brakes, let's wrap around. It's a single piston caliper here, unlike the MR2. But the MR2, this caliper is very big. I feel like they're the same size caliper, except the MR2 has 2 pistons instead of 1. Same little vent that cools the brakes. McPherson strut all out on this one. At the top, very similar suspension to a lot of newer Toyotas, actually. This is exactly how it is. And then if you look here, transfer case, all aluminum transfer case that goes out. See the drive shaft right here. It's actually a short section drive shaft with 2 center support bearings that are very close to each other. It's a very interesting drive shaft. Exhaust, all original on this one. Giant flex pipe. Of course, this is the area of that. And then we have a little cat that is turned. It's a cleanup cat that's turned this way. It's a very small cat. Again, talking 90s here. We didn't have big cats at that time. But then the brake line and fuel lines. For whatever reason, remember, Toyota was not as big of a company, of a car company at that time than they are today. They did things their own way. Look at the brake and fuel lines. They come out here, then they turn. Let's follow it. And then they turn again all the way to the side. And then they come back. And I mean, this is, and then they turn again and again. This is the opposite of what they do today. Today, they try to get these perfectly lined up, so it's very easy to assemble. They can make more cars. In these days, because this is a rallying car, they had to come out here, but they wanted to push it up. So now it's protected, and then it's even further protected. They could have just ran it right here in the middle, but they didn't want to do that. So you can have them protected. I mean, this is, just look at this, how intricate and how beautifully put together these turns of these brake lines. They're just, to me, this is, maybe I am a little nerdy about cars, but this is a work of art. And equally, if these go out and you have to replace them, I don't think anybody will be able to put them this beautifully and they'll just be this beautiful. Original muffler on this Celica with very low miles. Again, the body is flat. There's not really much going on here. Then we look at the back. See, if you watch my second channel when we review cars that are all-wheel drive, I always tell you, look at this cute little differential. This is not a cute little differential. Look at this massive behemoth that is cast iron. I mean, this is a very small car. This is a very heavy-duty differential and 2 axles going out of it. This is a beautiful thing to look at, I have to say that. Rear suspension, again, a little bit on the heavier duty side. You notice the arms are much bigger here, and you do have multi-arm and then a McPherson at the top. Very, very heavy-duty arms. I mean, you just look at them, they're really meant to take a beating. Single piston caliper in the back. This is also 4-wheel disc brake. And the parking brake is inside the rotor head. They figured we didn't need the fancy brake from the MR2. And of course, single muffler and 2 exhaust tips, the same muffler. Very just different. This car, in my opinion, it is really well preserved. Does have a few things that we took care of. One of them was a timing belt. One of them was a valve cover gasket leak, which was what the MR2 actually is in for the shop for. And this car comes to us from New York State, which they do have salt, so the owner really did a good job preserving. I mean, folks, you might see this and be like, well, it's dirty, it has a little bit of rust here. That's nothing. These cars rusted so bad in these times. They were nowhere near the rust protection that we have today. So this is a very, very preserved example. It just looks looks as good as you're ever going to get a car of this age. What a beautiful car. And the last thing I'm going to show you about it, the fuel tank is right here. You don't see that a lot in modern cars, and it is a steel fuel tank, because you hit this car, that's the first thing that takes the impact, and that's not good. So safety regulations, you notice, they were completely different back then. Folks, these two cars are truly special. I hope after you see this video, when you see one of them on the street, you appreciate them a little bit more. This comes from an era where Toyota took things to the next level. They were still a new company. They were really pushing to get their name out there for sports cars. And these two are the perfect example of that. And of course, the Mark III Supra, the Mark IV Supra, and things kind of went on from there. But eventually, they stopped because they did not want to keep putting all their dollars into R&D for cars that don't really sell a lot. These cars, they're special cars, they're halos, but in the end, everybody buys Toyotas for Camrys and Siennas and minivans and everyday cars. These cars kind of got left behind and they moved on. They brought some of them back, but these were truly special, in my opinion. The Celica kept going for the next generation. The MR2 in the next generation, it is nice, but not like this one. This one is truly special. Folks, these cars, whenever you see a Celica with this hood scoop, or an MR2 that says turbo in the back, know that these are the halo models. And they're so subtle, they're not show off and very strong, but they're just beautiful cars to drive, beautiful cars and technology, and it's just the way things were done, how purposeful they were. And at the end, even though they're a little complicated to work on, they were reliable. They're really well made, and that's what makes them special. And before we wrap up this video, we have to pull the herd of cars that are parked outside the shop, and then we're going to give you a quick tour of what we have going on in the shop this day. So we start with this beautiful LS430 timing belt, control arm bushings, valve cover gaskets. We're actually halfway. I'm done with the timing belt, done with this side, got to finish that side, and of course the radiator have seen better days on this, so we're actually waiting for this is an original radiator. I think this is a 2002, don't quote me on the years. Very clean engine. You see the inside of the valve cover, super clean engine. We're just setting up here. These are the control arm bushings. LS clips. If you watch my 600,000 mile one, you'll see it's quickly becoming the junkyard. I really need to. This is actually a motor that's going in a car, but that's junk. That's 600,000 mile trans. That's a junk transmission. These are wheels for our upcoming project. We're only going to give you a little sneak peek. You see the edge of the wheel? Let's see if you guys can really guess what this car is that we're going to bring up here on the channel in the future. This is a beautiful newer ES350. It's just here for a coolant replacement. Needs nothing. Actually, this is done. We're just delivering it tomorrow to the customer. This one is another LS430. I think this came from Michigan. We're doing what I call the LS Works. This needs front suspension, timing belt, a lot of little odds and ends. They basically brought me this car and they're like, we want to do almost the same thing that you did with the 600,000 mile Lexus, but to this one. It's a really clean car. It's actually a Southern car, so it doesn't have any rust. That is a Tacoma that we're probably going to end up doing a video on. That is a real Expedition Tacoma. It's been all over the world, and it's in for a clutch replacement. And we'll bring you guys, I'm pretty sure we're going to have to do a video on that one, because this is a really cool truck that's been around the world. These two, you already know what they're in. Timing belt, and actually Celica is done. The MR2 is not done. We haven't even written an estimate on it. That's how backed up we are. This RAV4, we're waiting for a part. There's a leak from a transfer case. Shop just pulled the transmission out, replaced all the seals, did the whole transfer case, and it's leaking worse than what they started with. So the owner kind of gave up on them, and it's here. We're waiting for parts, because I don't know how they got the parts, or even they did. I don't know. There's no parts for this. This is a very rare manual transmission one. This is another LS430. This one's actually done. You guys have seen this. This is one of the twins, which the other twin we'll talk to in a second. This one is done. It was front brakes, I think dipstick, O-ring, and cup holders. See, I remembered. I'm still working. This is a 14 or 13 Prius. I want to say it's a 13 Prius. Head gasket. It's done in rear shocks. This is actually done. They're picking it up. I think tomorrow they are picking this one up. This ES350, is in for a front timing cover, which is already done. It's actually all done. We're just waiting for one sensor. They decided to call it quits after we did all that. Front timing cover and evaporator. Evaporator was leaking, very common on this, becoming kind of a common thing with these. This is all done. We're just waiting for that one AF sensor, not O2 sensor. This is a 95 Camry, which needs a lot of work. The owner bought it for very cheap, and they really love the car, and they want to do everything, starting with this broken handle, which is a very common problem with these. That is the other twin of the LS430, which, what do you say, Jose? Should we leave them in suspense, or should we tell them? Let's just say that I had an earful for Mrs. Car Care Nut for this one. More on this car in the future. You'll see what we're talking about. This is 100-seater Line Cruiser, which is a beautiful car. A lot of work on this. We're actually working on the front axles. We pull the bearings, CV boots, everything in the front. We're almost done with this, but there's the odds and ends. Usually the little odds and ends, specific things that are not the standard repairs, I jump in and take care of them. The delicate stuff, kind of, but timing belt, stuff like that is just the simple stuff. We just get it done, and I am waiting for this to be done so I can jump on it and get the little stuff done. This is a 2003 Highlander, I think. It has a very mysterious evap leak, which we're looking into it. The only thing I don't like about this is it had somebody replace the filler neck, and they did a really horrendous job. It just looks terrible. Let's put it this way. So I might just end up replacing everything all over, because it looks horrible. We might end up doing a video on this, because this is truly not a nice job. 88 Supra. How should I say this about the 88 Supra and machine shops out there, folks? If you own a machine shop, please be good with your ETAs, because they told me the engine will be done next week a month ago. That's the best way I'm going to put it. So at this point, I just call the customer. I'm like, I'm at the mercy of the machine shop. They're a good machine shop, but their ETAs, not good. Literally, it'll be done next week a month ago, so I just gave up. They'll call, I guess, when they're done. That's my Camry. Pretty busy day at the shop. We have a lot going on and a lot more coming, and sometimes this is what stresses you out as a shop owner. It's like you have to remember what every car is doing, what's going on, be on top of the parts and fixing the cars and making sure you keep your ETAs, and then we're out of space. Literally, if a single person dropped off their car today or not pick it up today, we would be in trouble, because we don't keep our cars outside. This is something enforced by the landlord, and also I kind of like it. All my cars are here. I have cameras. If I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and want to make sure the herd is fine, I can look at them from my home and make sure they're fine. And that's just, I don't know, I'm just that kind of person. Folks, I hope this video is helpful, informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.